あの季節を見て、私に、洗わない枝が涼しくなります。枯葉は三枚もない林に、鳥の優香が取り残されます。
Konbanwa minasan. I'm sorry if this turns out to be another really long video, but I do intend to talk about this at some length. I've been meaning to talk about this for a while, actually, and but anyway, it's finally time. By the time you see this, it'll probably have been a month since Halloween, but still, like, spooky times continue, huh? So, today I'm going to be talking about a horror story that I found on the internet, and it's not a creepypasta, so don't worry. And the issues that I have with it, and the reason I think it doesn't work. So, to give some of my foreign friends, friends outside India, and really even like people who aren't really familiar with the popular culture of the part of the country that I live in, there's this radio show called Sunday Suspense, but of course it's pronounced in Bangla or Bengali, which is an Indian language, and it's Sunday Suspense. And you might guess from the name, but it's basically a radio show that basically narrates a story with, like characters voiced by different speakers. So it's a bit like a radio play, but with news stories every week. And they also have a YouTube channel, which is where I found the video that I'm going to talk about. So another couple of words about the channel. It's they adapt different kinds of stories. For instance, I remember being in. This feels kind of funny to say, but I remember this must have been back in school. I remember being in a salon for a haircut, of all things, and Sunday Suspense was playing on the radio. And that's actually how I came to hear, at least, the last part of a Bengali adaptation of the 9 Billion Names of God. And I liked it so much I went to read the original. So they do adapt some pretty good stories from time to time. So with no further ado, let's talk about tonight's topic. So I was scrolling on Facebook one fine day when I found this piece of fan art about one Sunday Suspense story. So I actually, got a little curious because I don't really listen to this show. Not only on radio, but not even on YouTube. Not really into it. But which isn't to say that it's bad. They adapt detective stories, horror stories, thrillers, what have you. So if people are into that, I completely get that. I'm just not a fan. Or at least I'm not familiar with most of their content, but I did feel curious because if a radio play is good enough for someone to make fan art of it, then maybe it's good. One of my friends had shared the photo. The painting. So hey, maybe it's something that I shouldn't miss out on. So I went on YouTube, and it did have plenty of views, the video, and I listened to it. My first impression is actually what I'm going to be basing my opinions in this video on, but obviously I did go and listen to it a second time. I actually seem to miss a few of the finer details listening to it, but I think it did improve a little overall and on its second auditing, viewing, what have you. The video on YouTube doesn't really have moving images or anything, no animation as such, and I think that's really nice, that they put all their effort into speech and narration and voice acting. So it did somewhat improve for me on a second auditing, but I still feel that, the original problems were right there. And the story is called Bhog, which is the Bengali word for a kind of alimentary offering, food offered to a god or goddess or deity, and usually distributed to worshippers and people afterwards. It's typically associated with I don't know, like certain ceremonies, because the word you might be familiar with for similar offerings in Indian religion is prasad, which is the Bengali form of prasad or prasadam, which is, again, offerings made to a deity. So, as the name suggests, it's the story of a man who offers food to a goddess, a statue of a goddess that he finds, and who begins to encounter supernatural phenomena. Generally, like that's plot outline. I don't mean to spoil the story, both because many people are likely to enjoy it, and also because I don't want to step on anyone's toes here. I don't want to attack anyone, and definitely not the people who put so much effort into making this. So definitely go and watch the original. If you don't speak Bangla, I'm not sure if even with captions you could make out what the story is about. However, the thing is that it's based on a written story, and the video actually introduces the author. And maybe if this video of mine takes off, maybe I'll actually go and look at the original, which was a little different, allegedly, from the video, from the radio play. So if you don't speak Bengali, consider finding a translation of the story. But if you can't, I guess it's fine. I'll give you a general outline just to be able to criticize the story. So the story is about a man living in Kolkata or Calcutta, and for my foreign friends, that's in eastern India. That's where people who speak Bengali or Bangla live. So that's a very homely setting for a story in Bengali. So what happens is this man buys an antique statue, which turns out to have been made by a kind of mystic sage. So it was designed as part of the rituals of Tibetan Buddhism and Tantrism. So as a story, I mean, there's plenty of information on this in the story, and I've sort of gathered that quite a few Sunday Suspense stories have this problem with what we tend to call an info dump. But anyway, there's an info dump later in the story. What just one man explains what's going on with the scary statue. But in short, basically, it's the embodiment of a unique deity who has rather frightening properties, so to speak. So after this man, the protagonist, takes home the statue, he starts to have visions of the goddess asking him to worship her. He starts doing this, despite the warnings of people around him, and eventually he unwittingly takes home with him a kind of witch, or a kind of evil spirit in service to that goddess, because that goddess was dissatisfied with the method of worship. And as we learn later in the story, she's a very unique and admittedly frightening deity in her pantheon. She's only meant to be worshipped by select initiates in certain ways, and the protagonist had offended her by worshiping her in a very ordinary, homely Bengali way. And in the end, the witch that I mentioned, who is in hiding, but it's basically revealed through certain clues. Typical horror story stuff, unwitting protagonist comes upon frightening images, but chooses to ignore them. And anyway, in the end, he's almost killed and sacrificed to the goddess himself, but he's rescued by the magical power or the tantric power of let's just call it an amulet given to him by a ghost. Now, I don't mean to make light of the story. It's very well narrated, personally speaking, in the video. So again, definitely consider checking that out. Maybe even if you don't speak Bangla, just switch to any portion in that long video and just try and listen to the sounds. And like, thanks to the narration, the music, you might get like a sense of what the story is like. But anyway, I basically have three major issues with the story. I mean, maybe these aren't in any necessary order, but still, like, let's start talking about one and then talk about a related problem and so on. So I think, like, my first issue with the story is how it disappoints the reader with the switch in focus. Now look, like any competent horror story, horror writing, whatever, the story really puts the statue in a place of focus, like front and center. In the first half, or even like, you know, most of the story, which is really cool because, like, if you're a fan of horror stories in general, like, you know, like anything, H.P. Lovecraft, Junji Ito, Edgar Allan Poe, it helps if, like, there's an object of terror, right? But of course, like, you know, you can experiment with horror and write more abstract horror or like psychological horror, but it's something if, like, there's a really physical, what's the word? Like, phenomenologically real object to be afraid of. And what I hoped on my first reading or viewing is that, I mean, this statue would be, you know, like the cause of the hero's downfall or the protagonist's downfall. Maybe in an almost Greek tragic fashion. Maybe he would be so carried away by his worship, which is something that the story really fleshes out as it goes on, right? Which is why it's so disappointing that maybe the antagonist would, the protagonist would be so focused on the goddess that eventually he would start committing crimes for her. And I think, like, that would be a very interesting way of telling the story, because it's already foreshadowed in the first part. Because, like, he has a family friend, a kind of father figure. He has a sort of mother figure, a very devoted old servant who looks after him. And he's also shown to have a friend. So it would be very interesting if he turned into some kind of, sorcerer or, warlock or whatever, and he actually attacked the people around him. Maybe, you know, his friend could come in at the last minute to stop him from committing some kind of horrible sacrifice. And that would be a little a little childish maybe, but I think it would really go with the overall tone of the story. Unfortunately, that is not what happens. We go from a story about dream visions and a mysterious statue through quite a bit of third-person narration about people we don't actually see in the story, or, you know, people who aren't living characters, to a climax that's basically centered on a very pedestrian figure, that of, you know, the witch, or the how do I even translate the word? Because I think the word that I'm hesitating to say has spiritual connotations in Buddhism. But anyway, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the figure of the witch, her name is Damri, is a very disappointing figure, because instead of, you know, that more subtle, distinctly psychological, terror of, this mysterious statue that's compelling the protagonist through dream visions to do something that's always hinted at but never quite explicated is, I mean, it's definitely like a powerful image in terms of horror, right? Because like it's fairly obvious that we're going to see some gore in the story because it's called Bhog, right? And that's about food. So we can assume that someone is going to have a kind of a consumption or horrific, the experience similar to body terror or something. And I'm being a little vague here, so I don't scandalize people who aren't interested in horror. But the general idea was that the protagonist himself would become a kind of antagonist, and instead we have a very uninspiring ghost figure, really, a flesh-eating witch who levitates, who shoots fire from her feet, who kills people, who and really, I mean, spoiler, but perhaps the most disappointing part for me was that the way it was left up in the air and then left undetermined about how exactly the goddess statue was consuming her offerings, and that was completely annihilated in the final few minutes of the story, because it turns out the witch was eating the offerings after cooking it herself. And I mean, come on. I mean, that wasn't even frightening for me at that point. I mean, the climax is pretty disappointing anyway. Maybe I'll get to that, but just that image of like the witch eating the offerings and spraying some of it on the floor was just so stupid for me. Like, why couldn't it be left to a little of our imaginations? And again, like speaking about the climax, as I said, it's also kind of dumb. It's interesting. I'll admit that it's interesting, but I think it goes into a little too much detail with this, because you've got these horrific figures of skeletons and corpses dancing and hounds from hell, and the protagonist doesn't really do anything to rescue himself. But of course, I can, off the top of my head, I can think of one of H.P. Lovecraft's stories. In fact, quite a few of Lovecraft's stories where the protagonist just encounters horrific things without being able to do anything. So, okay, maybe that's a horror staple. Maybe that's permissible. But centering horror on the figure of a flesh-eating witch just ruins the story that could otherwise have had so much truly dramatic impact, maybe even tragic impact, because of the character of the hero and the protagonist, and how it changes. So moving on, about this witch, I have another issue. So it's kind of like classist, and if you're familiar with the word, it's also kind of casteist. How this dark-skinned poor woman turns out to be a flesh-eating monster. Now, I guess like this could be completely unintentional, obviously, because you can only put so many characters in a story, and to make it plausible, you would have to have a character like that in that position of the story, right? It makes sense that a kind-hearted protagonist would bring a starving woman home. But even so, doesn't that ultimately cast poor people, women from the suburbs and villages who come to work to the city, dark-skinned people and people from lower castes, or I don't know, just any intersection of those categories as villains? I mean, I won't say that it's like literally saying that poor people are evil, but I found it in somewhat poor taste. sometimes something can be in poor taste without being extremely objectionable. But I do feel that that figure is not only detracting from the story in terms of plot, but it's also sort of just kind of offensive. I mean, I'm not, I'm not exactly from that class of people, but I feel sort of personally attacked. Like it's almost like it's racist against Indian people, but it's written by an Indian man. So actually, like that actually brings me to another point. It also felt kind of racist against Tibetan people. Like I don't know, like it's okay, I guess, because again, like in that broad exposition that we get towards the end of the story, we learn that honestly, like let me just skip to the part where there was this man who learned Tantra and Vajrayana Buddhism and completed every initiation into its innermost rites. And he's the man who built the statue that's in the story. So I don't know, like it does talk about some of his life in Tibet, and it's not as though like every Tibetan person mentioned there is evil. Of course not. And again, there is a disclaimer at the start of the video that the story is not meant to offend any caste, creed, or religion. But again, it sort of rubbed me the wrong way. And that doesn't mean that I'm out to get offended. Like, it just that maybe it's because of like the times that I'm consuming the story in, or I don't know, maybe the fact that I know one or two Tibetan people, that it just feels kind of odd to have like this object of mystery and terror coming from a place that has like real ordinary people. Again, like as with the figure of the witch, Damri, I don't think that it's inevitably contemptible, but there you go. Like it sort of rubs you the wrong way. But of course, my main problem with the story is how the plot is sort of sidetracked into this ghost story about a flesh-eating monster. And again, that sort of like brings me to my last point, and I'm sure people who don't like to hear me speak are very happy that I'm almost finished. The thing is that the protagonist doesn't even get to save himself. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, this might have a touch of Lovecraftian horror because in Lovecraft's original stories, human beings cannot really do anything against the preternatural or supernatural forces that they see. But again, like in a story, you would expect, especially a story with what you can call a happy ending. You would expect the protagonist to have some role to play in that, or maybe someone also introduced in the first part of the story. Maybe his old friend, maybe his actually like maybe his family friend, maybe his young friend. But no, what actually happens is that almost like almost divorced from the mainstream of this plot, what happens is that the protagonist is just chilling at a burning ghat, or as the Bengali word is, shashan. So that's where he meets this mysterious person who finds that he's a kind man. So this person, who turns out to be a ghost actually, gives him a kind of amulet to keep on him, and it's that enchanted amulet given to him because he's kind that saves him in the end. It basically protects him as a halo. It clears his mind, and it prevents the witch from hurting him or his friend. And in the end, it's what destroys the witch and helps him, get rid of the statue. Now, I did find in the comments of the original video, and I wouldn't have known it otherwise. Like, I don't know, maybe shame on me for not knowing, but apparently the name of that ghost, as it were, is actually a famous researcher of Tantra, or Tontru. So the Bengali word is Tontru, and someone who practices it is a Tantric. So anyway, this man was a famous Tantric, and he found that the protagonist was a good man and gave him a charm or amulet to protect him. So, okay, there is a little bit of agency in that because it's because of who the protagonist is and his act of kindness in the story that he's given the amulet. But I still feel that like the way the story goes on, it gets kind of dumb because the protagonist has so little to do, but he still does something. What he does in the end, like spoiler again, is take off his amulet, the one that's been protecting him, and throw it at the witch. And somehow this actually works. This destroys her in some tornado of light, and everyone's rescued. I mean, good for them, I guess. But really, I mean, it's a charm that he wears, and it sort of clears his head. But I again would have liked a little more, a little less. Grandiose horror with its almost childish elements of gothic paraphernalia, and I would have liked a little more character interaction. That would have been nice instead of big info dump towards the end, and then this old man coming to save him, and then even the old man is incapacitated. He just passes out, and then the amulet saves both of them, and then he sort of just decides to throw it at the witch, and it just works. So yeah, this might be a very casual response to the video, but again, that's okay. This isn't meant to be like a personal attack on anyone involved in that story. It was kind of entertaining, and I just wish that it could have stayed on track a little more. There are only so many ways to write a horror story, so it's somewhat inevitable that some religious or ethnic minorities get dragged into it. But again, that also rubbed me a little the wrong way. But with that being said, I don't think it's that bad of a story. I just think that a lot of its buildup was wasted. So maybe more gradual info dump, a somewhat tighter story in terms of location. So like having the protagonist restrict his movement somehow would give it a kind of unity of place, which I think would go a long way towards making it a tighter, more frightening story, and definitely just like getting rid of the figure of the witch altogether, or at least as far as possible, would have really worked. Like I would really like to read a story about just this mysterious statue that corrupts an ordinary man. So anyway, let me know in the comments if you like this video, or just text me back because I sent this to my friends. And if you really like it, I might consider going looking for the original book and maybe reviewing that. But anyway, thank you for watching.